Hi guys, so we're going to do another Darlie Routier myths versus facts video. This one is really exciting, and again, I would really like to thank the awesome Facebook page Why Darlie Routier is Innocent, Myth versus Fact, for allowing me to share these with you because they're so good, and these are probably going to be some of the best ones, I think. So I'm really excited to share them with you. Let's just get right on into it. Myth number 7. Medical personnel stated that Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted. Not one doctor stated that Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted. Below is testimony from some of the doctors who testified at trial. Note that excerpts are marked with volume and section numbers in parentheses. Dr. Janis Townsend-Parchman. Direct examination by Greg Davis. Dr. Townsend-Parchman met with Darlie for about 10 minutes on the afternoon of June 6, 1996. Let me also ask you, Doctor, whether or not on June 6, 1996, you received a call from the Rowlett Police Department. Not me personally. Someone out there at the medical examiner's office? Yes. Okay, as a result of that phone call, did you go to Baylor Hospital in Dallas? Yes, I did. And while at Baylor Hospital, did you have an opportunity to see the defendant in this case, Darlie Lynn Routier? Yes, I did. She had observed Darlie's wounds and was asked whether they could have been self-inflicted. Do you have an opinion as to whether or not the injuries to Miss Routier's right arm, her left shoulder, and her neck could have been self-inflicted? Objection by defense counsel. The court overrules. Go ahead. Is it possible that they were? Almost anything is possible. What juries should be concerned with is probability, not possibility. However, the doctor's testimony clearly demonstrates that she was in no way telling the jury that Darlie had indeed self-inflicted her own wounds. Cross-examination by Douglas Mulder. The doctor explained why she was at the hospital to see Darlie. I was there at the request of the police, through the people in our office, and the question I had been asked to answer was, is it possible the injuries were self-inflicted? Just hours after her surgery, on the same day of the murders, Darlie was apparently being looked at as a viable suspect. Again, focus ought to be on probability rather than possibility. Regarding the knife wounds to Darlie's right arm, the doctor had this to say. Okay, and did he, the doctor treating Darlie, tell you that he had the two, what do you characteristically call those injuries to this area of the arm? Well, if they were on this young man and he had injuries that you've described and observed from Miss Routier, would you not characterize those in your autopsy protocol as defensive wounds? They could be construed as such. Could be construed as defensive wounds, couldn't they? They could be. Mr. Mulder asked Dr. Townsend-Parchman about the possibility of the neck wound being a hesitation wound. Okay, and generally associated with self-inflicted, say a suicide for example, or attempted suicide. Don't you have what are frequently referred to as hesitation wounds? They may be present. Okay, and this is a situation where the individual, once they cut the skin, decide that maybe it's not a good idea after all, and then jerk back or stop, and then they get a little more. And you will see lots of jerks in the outer portions of the skin, won't you, traditionally? Yes, you may. Okay, and isn't it fair to say, in all fairness to Miss Routier, isn't it fair to say that her wounds in the neck are quite deep for hesitation wounds? Not necessarily. Okay, is it another maybe yes, maybe no type of deal? I would say that usually what I think you're thinking of as hesitation wounds go into the dermis, but certainly I have seen hesitation wounds that went deeper than that, into the musculature. Okay, traditionally aren't as deep as Miss Routier's, are they? Well, ordinarily, most of the hesitation wounds I have seen were not that deep. Redirect examination by Greg Davis. Mr. Davis asked the doctor to describe hesitation wounds. And normally, what do hesitation wounds look like? Well, I would say if you have got more than one, they will often crisscross and go into the dermis. Darlie's neck wound went beyond the dermis. That means it was not consistent with what would be expected of a self-inflicted hesitation wound in terms of depth. Mr. Davis asked whether the small knife wound to Darlie's right arm was a hesitation wound. Can you tell whether or not that's a hesitation wound or not? It could be. There is nothing in the doctor's testimony that proves Darlie self-inflicted her injuries. Not once did the doctor even say that a particular wound was probably self-inflicted. At most, she told us that there was a possibility, and no more, that the wounds were self-inflicted. Dr. Alejandro Santos. Cross-examination by Preston Douglas. Dr. Santos operated on Darlie's wounds and had this to say about Darlie's neck wound. You have no opinion about self-inflicted or directionality or anything like that? I cannot tell. You can't tell? Right. Is that right? Yes. And you were the first trained medical person to look at this woman, is that right? Well, Dr. Dillon and the paramedics? Right. But the first person to treat her and look at her closely, that was you, right? Yes. Dr. Santos, who actually performed the surgery, could make no determination as to whether the slash to the throat was self-inflicted. Dr. Vincent DiMaio. Hearing by Toby Shook. Dr. DiMaio was called by the defense to testify as to the following. Dr. DiMaio, my name is Toby Shook. I just have a few questions for you for this hearing. What opinions have you come to testify for today? 1, that the injuries incurred by Miss Routier are those that would be incurred if one was assaulted with a knife and are not consistent with self-inflicted wounds. The doctor went on to say, okay, the first opinion you said was that Miss Routier's wounds would have been, did you say consistent with an assailant? What I'm saying is that based on the location and direction of the wounds and the nature of the wounds, these are the type of wounds that one would get if one was assaulted rather than self-inflicted. They are not consistent with self-inflicted wounds. Direct examination by Douglas Mulder. Dr. DiMaio was asked whether the bruising on Darlie's arms was consistent with self-infliction. Okay, Dr. DiMaio, are those injuries consistent or inconsistent with having been self-inflicted, the bruising? That is, I would say it's inconsistent. I mean, how do you get blunt force injuries here? I mean, it's easy to get blunt force injuries here if you want, you know, I can bang my arm against the edge here, but to here, and also again, it's very widespread. I mean, this is a lot of force. Everybody has bumped into something and you get a bruise, but look at this. It's just really severe hemorrhage up and down the arm. This is tremendous force. The doctor discussed previous cases where he had seen self-inflicted wounds. Okay, Dr. DiMaio, have you had occasion in the past to examine injuries or render an opinion as regards to whether or not those injuries were self-inflicted? Yes, the last time I think was about just before Christmas. A nurse shot her, I think it was common law husband, and her defense was that he attacked her with a knife. And you know, they were obviously self-inflicted wounds. And my office had in the last 3 or 4 years, 2 other cases where the defense was, you know, it was self-defense. And I warded off a knife, and these are defense wounds, you know. These wounds were incurred, but actually they were incised wounds. One was, I think, an oral surgeon, and another one a dentist. And again, I had another case of a doctor who self-inflicted wounds and was trying to say he was attacked. The above excerpt goes to the credibility of the doctor's findings. He is drawing on his experience with self-inflicted wounds to testify about Darlie's wounds. Dr. DiMaio was then asked about why Darlie's injuries would be inconsistent with self-infliction. All right, Dr. DiMaio, assume that Darlie Routier is right-handed. Are those injuries that you observed in these photographs, are they consistent or inconsistent with self-infliction? They are inconsistent with self-infliction. Both the wounds, the stab wounds on the back of the right forearm and the stab wounds on the neck, because if you look at the really incised wounds, when I say incised, I mean a cut. And an incised wound is when you know the sharp edge of a knife runs across her body, but a stab wound is the tip going into it. And you can see here and here demonstrating. Then if we go up close, this is a much better close-up. And what this shows is that this wound has started on the right side of her neck here, across the midline, going in a downward path, and then there's a gap, and then there's a second wound. So essentially, if you look at me, there's an incised wound going like this, gap, and then there's another knife wound here. And you know, if you think the ruler, think about this. If this is a knife and you're right-handed, I mean, you're going to have to be going like this, the edge of the knife, and then skipping a place like that, then changing hands and doing 2 stab wounds here, this way. And because, you know, people don't do things the hard way, they do things simple. So this, you know, try and say, you know, you're going to cut like this, and then you have to cut like that, and then stab. Doesn't make any sense for self-inflicted wounds for a right-handed person. And people who are right-handed use their right hand for infliction of wounds because you don't think about it. If I handed any of you this, you would pick it up with your dominant hand. You wouldn't think anything. You would pick it up with your left hand. You wouldn't pick it up with your left hand and manipulate it. It's too difficult. And people don't think about that. They're not going to say, oh, I'm going to switch hands. Now, like I said, the people I saw were doctors and nurses, and they self-inflicted with the right hand, which is their dominant. So that's pretty important. Very intelligent people who might be able to tell the difference between self-inflicted wounds and something that would have happened during, you know, an attack. They were doing this with their right hand, and Darlie would have had to have done it with her left hand, which, you know, to me that says they would have been more likely, I think, to try to trick someone than Darlie would be, and they didn't. So I can understand why he's saying that it's not very likely, and I definitely agree with that. The wounds to Darlie's right arm are, if self-inflicted, would have had to have been made using her non-dominant hand. The neck wound would also have been made using predominantly her left hand. And assuming the shoulder wound is a continuation of the neck wound, which it may or may not be, the same would apply. Cross-examination by Toby Shook. Mr. Shook asked the doctor if it was impossible for Darlie to have self-inflicted her wounds. Okay, now as far as your opinion about the defendant self-inflicting these wounds, are you saying that it is impossible that it couldn't have happened? No, what I'm saying is that based upon their location and their path and the nature of the wounds, it's more probable, the term I used, that it's inflicted by someone else. And anything is possible, but I am saying in this case it's not probable. The doctor emphasized that the focus is on probability, not possibility. Mr. Shook asked Dr. DiMaio about the possibility of the small knife wound to the arm being a hesitation wound. The smaller wound we see here could be consistent with sort of a hesitation wound, couldn't it? You could say that if you think they are self-inflicted, or if it's not self-inflicted, it's just a small stab wound. Right, it could go either way, but it could be consistent with someone stabbing their arm and then stabbing it with greater force right below it. Right, what I'm talking about is medical probability. I'm not talking about possibility. Which, you know, I thought about that when I read it the first time, and I was thinking, you know, if someone is attacking you and you're swinging and pulling away, of course, you would be fighting and pulling away. If they were swinging and you pulled at the same time, they might just barely nick you instead of it going in and really stabbing you. So I could see how that could happen for sure. Probability, not possibility. Regarding the bruising on Darlie's arm, the doctor stated it would be very difficult to self-inflict such trauma. If you wanted to do it, inflict blunt force trauma, or you could just take your arm against the wall and whack it real hard, couldn't you? The wall wouldn't work because your hand would hit also. Your hand would hit? Okay, but you could do it if you wanted to. It's possible. It would be very hard. Dr. DiMaio stated that the wounds were not consistent with self-infliction. Therefore, the probability of Darlie having inflicted these injuries upon herself is low. Unlike the doctors called by the prosecution who talked of possibility, Dr. DiMaio concentrates on probability. Conclusion. For a claim to be made that the wounds were self-inflicted, mere possibility should not suffice. The claim that doctors stated that Darlie's wounds were self-inflicted is a myth. The claim that they said that they were likely self-inflicted is also a myth. In reality, Dr. Santos gave no opinion about self-infliction. Dr. Patrick Dillon didn't mention self-infliction at all, hence none of his testimony was provided above, and Dr. Townsend-Parchman merely said that it was possible Darlie inflicted her own injuries. Dr. DiMaio was the only doctor to testify as to medical probability. Yet the prosecution based its opinion of self-infliction on the mere possibility raised by Dr. Townsend-Parchman and not on any of the standards of medical probability. From the medical evidence, it's clear that there is no evidence that Darlie inflicted her own injuries. But of course, if you start with the conclusion that Darlie is guilty, then by necessity, she must have injured herself. There's some skin layers. This is what the knife went through. It went beyond the dermis. Looks like it went down into here. All right. That's number 7. Information about Darlie's hemoglobin and Darlie's hemoglobin levels. Hemoglobin. Each red blood cell contains 280 million hemoglobin molecules. Hemoglobin is a complex molecule, and it is the most important component of red blood cells. It is composed of protein, globulin, and a molecule, heme, which binds to iron. In the lungs, these are going to be a bunch of words I can't say, I'm sure. In the lungs, the heme component binds to oxygen in exchange for carbon dioxide. The oxygenated red blood cells are then transported to the body's tissues, where the hemoglobin releases the oxygen in exchange for carbon dioxide, and the cycle repeats. The oxygen is used in the mitochondria, the power source within all cells. Okay, you know what? I'm probably not going to read all this. Darlie's hemoglobin fell to 9.6. A fall from even 12 is significant. Hemoglobin calculator for diagnosis of anemia. Hemoglobin, age or gender group, calculation. 6 is the cutoff with the calculator for severe anemia. Okay. Uncompensated blood loss, acute. Okay, you know what? We're going to skip this because that is a little more of what we've already read, I think. Probably going to skip that too. Let's just go on to this. Myth number 8. Darlie's arms got bruised from Devon kicking her. Some non-supporters have argued that the bruising on Darlie's arms was the result of boys kicking her during the attack. Even juror Rena Way, during an episode of Leeza, expressed the opinion that Devon had kicked at Darlie. This myth document analysis, the autopsy report of Devon Routier, in order to determine if this claim has any merit. For a similar analysis of Damon Routier's autopsy report, see myth number 9. Devon Routier was 6 years old at the time of his death. His autopsy was performed on 6/6/96 at 1:10 p.m., having been murdered sometime between 1 a.m. and 2:30 a.m. that same day. The following definitions may assist when reading the autopsy findings below. The palmar surface of the hand is the palm of your hand. The thenar eminence is the fleshy piece of the lower palm of your hand just below the thumb. An abrasion is an area where the skin has come into contact with another object and caused friction, such as an Indian burn or a carpet burn. Contusion is the medical name for a bruise. Posterior reference to the body always refers back to the anatomical position, standing erect, feet apart, and arms dangling, with palms facing forward and thumbs away from the body. Petechial hemorrhage refers to pinpoint, or less than 3 millimeters, red or purple areas caused by broken capillaries. Punctate just means dots. Note that bruises are green or brown and are not likely to have happened that same day. See the diagrams below. Relevant findings from the autopsy report. The palmar surface of the left hand shows 2 1/16 inch fairly round abrasions. The thenar eminence of the left hand shows an area of bluish contusion measuring 1.25 times by 0.5 inches. The thenar eminence of the right hand shows a similar bluish contusion that measures 1.5 by 0.75 inches in its greatest dimension. There is a 1 by 0.5 inch area of abrasion on the posterior aspect of the right arm below the elbow. The left side of the neck had a faint linear area of punctate petechial hemorrhage that measures 1.75 inches in length. There is a 0.5 inch superficial abrasion on the left upper arm and back region. There is an area of greenish contusion on the left hip that measures 0.5 inch in its greatest dimension. 2 brown contusions that measure 0.25 inch in greatest dimension are noted on the anterior surface of the right lower leg. In conclusion, Devon Routier had no bruising whatsoever to either foot. There is part of the hand that they were talking about. Okay, you know what? Okay, yeah. That's petechia, the dots, and then this is a bruise, and this is a scratch. That is the difference here. Autopsy report. So that didn't happen. Let's do number 9. Myth number 9, Darlie's arms got bruised from Damon kicking her. This myth document follows on from myth number 8. Myth number 8 can be found at this link. Here, Damon Routier's autopsy findings will be examined in order to dispel the notion that Damon caused the massive bruising to Darlie's arms by kicking her. Damon Routier was murdered on June 6, 1996. He was 5 years old. His official time of death was 3:26 a.m., although he had stopped breathing approximately an hour earlier. His autopsy was performed that same morning at 9:15 a.m. The following notes will assist in understanding terminology used in the autopsy findings. The dorsum of the foot is the top of the foot, not the sole or the heel. A contusion is a bruise. The dorsa of the toes refers to the nail side of the toes. Below are the findings from the autopsy, described in the report as the other injuries. On the uppermost mid-back, there is a 2.5 inch area of light red abrasion and contusions. On the right side of the mid-back, laterally, there is a 0.5 inch very pale pink area that contains a 3/16 inch red-brown scab. Please note that there was not sufficient time for an abrasion to show healing by turning pale pink and forming a scab if the wound had been inflicted between 1 a.m., the time Darren went to bed, and 3:26 a.m. on June 6th. On the posterolateral right arm, proximally, there is a 0.75 inch faint brown linear scab. On the dorsum of the right foot, there is a 0.25 inch red abrasion. On the left pretibial area, there are multiple up to 1.5 inch tan brown contusions. Please note that a tan brown bruise suggests it is an older bruise. On the dorsa of the left toes, there are a few up to 1/8 inch yellow tan abrasions. As can be seen from the autopsy report, Damon did not have any bruising or wounds to the underside of his feet. Okay, this shows the feet. Okay, okay. So, that didn't happen. That is not how Darlie got the bruises on her arms. Let's see. Myth number 10. There was no timeline. Darlie had plenty of time to commit the murders and stage the crime scene. This is good too. The timeline was introduced by Darlie's defense team to show that it would have been almost physically impossible for Darlie to have murdered her children. It is based on the length of time which Damon could have lived after being stabbed. The prosecution convinced the jury that Darlie had enough time to kill the boys and stage the scene. But did she really? Dr. Janis Townsend-Parchman, who performed Damon's autopsy, was asked by the attorneys how long Damon could have lived after being stabbed. Direct examination by Greg Davis. Do you have an opinion whether or not these wounds would have caused this child to die instantly? Yes, I have an opinion, and no, he would not have. Okay, do you have any? Can you give us an estimate of the amount of time that you believe this child could have survived with these 4 stab wounds in the back? Minutes. Cross-examination by Douglas Mulder. Okay, so from the time that he received all of these injuries, he could have lasted as little as 2 or 3 minutes, or as much as maybe 5 or 6 minutes, something like that? Yes. Okay. Even conceivably a little longer. Maybe as much as 8 or 9 minutes? You can't tell. So, possibly as much as 8 or 9 minutes, but it's hard to tell. That's not very long at all. Let's assume that Damon did, in fact, manage to cling to life for 9 minutes. Damon died in the care of paramedic Jack Kolbye, who upon entering the Routier home found Damon lying face down in the Roman room. Direct examination by Greg Davis. You say that you turned him over, is that right? I rolled him over, yes sir. Okay, and what, if anything, occurred when you rolled the child over? He gasped for a gasp of air, and that was the final time that he breathed. When he gasped, did you notice whether or not his eyes were open? Yes, sir, his eyes were open, and there were still a light of life in those eyes. Did you ever see that light go out of his eyes? Yes, sir. As I was with the child, it slowly faded. This is hard. So after Damon was stabbed and before he died, Darlie is alleged to have performed a number of tasks. But first we must factor in that Darlie was on the phone to 911 for 5 minutes and 44 seconds. The call and transcription can be found here. And that the paramedics were not allowed into the home until first responders officers David Waddell and Lieutenant Matt Walling had secured the scene. Waddell arrived first and could be heard on the 911 tape. Walling arrived at the same time as the ambulance after the 911 call had ended. Lieutenant Matt Walling, cross-examination by Douglas Mulder. Well, at any rate, you arrived there shortly after that 911 call, didn't you? Yes, sir. Walling entered the house and spoke with Waddell. The 2 officers then went through the kitchen and the utility room and into the garage, where they made a visual inspection. They saw the cut window screen but found no intruder. So they then went back to the Roman room. Walling exited the house and went over to where the ambulance was parked. He informed the paramedics that it was safe to go in. The paramedics had waited between 1 and 2 minutes for permission to enter the home. Okay. Maybe it's protocol to have backup when you clear a house, but to two little children there needing help. I really wish that he would have at least cleared the house quickly. 1 to 2 minutes, you know, I mean, who knows? I don't know. I guess if that's what they're supposed to do, but whatever. I think it's terrible. Let's see. Paramedic Brian Koshak, direct examination by Greg Davis. Okay, did you and paramedic Kolbye immediately get out of the ambulance and go inside the house? Not immediately, no, sir. Did you wait for Sergeant Walling to clear the house for you? Yes, sir. Do you know about how much time it took for Sergeant Walling to clear the house before you and paramedic Kolbye would be allowed inside? 1 to 2 minutes. Did he, in fact, come out and tell you it was okay to go inside the house? He did. Paramedic Jack Kolbye, direct examination by Greg Davis. And when you and Koschak actually parked there at the residence, did y'all immediately get out and go into the house? No, we didn't. We stayed inside because it was a possible stabbing, waiting for the police to let us know that the scene would be clear. Okay, so you were going to wait on some police officer to actually come out and tell you it was okay to come in, right? That or the dispatcher, yes, sir. All right, do you know how long that you and Koschak waited out in the ambulance before someone actually gave you the word it was okay to go in and start treating? Less than 2 minutes. All right, and who was it that actually told you that it was okay for y'all to go in? Officer Walling. Let's say that the paramedics waited 1 minute and 30 seconds before exiting their vehicle. They then went across to the house and entered it. Kolbye walked over to Damon and rolled him over, and as was stated above, at some point thereafter, Damon breathed his last breath. Let's approximate that it took roughly 30 seconds, if not more, from the time that paramedics were given the all clear to when Damon breathed for the final time. Therefore, adding the 5:44, the 1:30, and the 30 gives us a total of 7 minutes and 44 seconds. Subtracting that time from the 9 minutes that Damon could have lived, that gives Darlie approximately 1 minute and 16 seconds to do the following after stabbing the boys. Here we go. Get a sock smeared with the boy's blood and run 75 yards down the alleyway to deposit it. Run 75 yards back to the house. Slice her own throat using her non-dominant hand. Cut her right arm using her non-dominant hand. Stab her upper left chest area using her dominant hand, or using her non-dominant hand if the chest wound is a continuation of the neck slash. Inflict a second small knife wound on her right arm using her non-dominant hand. Superficially cut her fingers with the dominant hand. Go into the Roman room and bleed around the room, including on the couches. Go into the utility room and bleed in there. Run the vacuum cleaner around the kitchen, pick it up, carry it a few feet, put it back down, and then push it about. And repeat this procedure at least 2 more times. See Tom Bevel's testimony. That's interesting. I don't remember that. Clean blood from the sink and kitchen bench. Wipe up bloody footprints from kitchen floor. Wipe a bloody handprint off the couch. Break a wine glass and call to Darren. Could Darlie really have done all of that in 1 minute and 16 seconds? Note that Darlie is alleged to have performed various other tasks as part of her staging efforts too. However, listed above are things which she only could have done after stabbing the boys. That is probably a great video to watch, a link that explains this timeline. And there's the testimony. Let's see. All right, myth number 11. Damon was attacked in 2 separate instances. It is almost universally accepted among non-supporters that Damon was stabbed twice, that is, on 2 separate occasions. Damon received a total of 6 stab and incise wounds to his body. Non-supporters claim, and quite frequently assert as fact, that he was stabbed first as he slept near the sofa, and then again by the wall near the entry hall of the home. I believe this is all blood. But in reality, there is nothing to support this claim. Dr. Janis Townsend-Parchman performed the autopsy on Damon. On her direct and redirect examination, Prosecutor Greg Davis attempted to suggest that there was an indication that Damon had been stabbed twice. Here was what was said on redirect examination. Now again, looking at Damon's wounds, is there any way for you to tell whether or not all 4 of these stab wounds were produced at the same time? No, there is not. Is it possible that stab wound, say, number 1 occurred, and then some period of time elapsed before stab wound 2, 3, and 4 occurred? That's possible. Defense attorney Douglas Mulder had just one question for the doctor on recross examination. Doctor, is there anything to suggest that all those wounds were not all received at the same time, or at approximately the same time? There is nothing. They don't suggest anything. Thank you. It is readily apparent from the 2 excerpts that there is no evidence to suggest the knife wounds were inflicted at different times. It is, of course, possible, but juries should not be convicting people based on mere possibility. Anything is possible, but incumbent upon the prosecution is to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. It ought also to be noted that defense need not prove that all the knife injuries were sustained at the same time. The defendant, theoretically, retains the presumption of innocence until the state proves otherwise. If there was a second stabbing, it was up to the state to prove it. But why come up with the second stabbing theory in the first place? Upon reading the following excerpt from Dr. Townsend-Parchman's redirect examination, the reasons become clear. If only one of these stab wounds had occurred, and then an interval of time had elapsed before stab wounds 2, 3, and 4 occurred, for instance, could this child have lived longer than the period that you've already talked about? That's possible. Can you give us an estimate of how long this child might have lived if, say, stab wound 1 had been inflicted and then the other 3 were inflicted sometime later on? What we're talking about, a few to several more minutes. The second attack theory appears to have been introduced in order to circumvent the restrictions of the timeline. The timeline, which was the topic of Mythic number 10, gives Darlie a little over a minute to have completed a long list of tasks. It strongly suggests that Darlie simply did not have enough time available to her to commit the murders. By introducing this new and unsubstantiated second attack theory, non-supporters are now able to argue that Darlie did have enough time to commit the murders and stage the crime scene, because it was from the second lot of stabbings that Damon could have lived no more than approximately 9 minutes. For further discussion, see myth number 10. With no medical evidence to support this theory, non-supporters have turned to the blood map. Yeah. Like the red is Damon. The green is Darlie. The yellow is Devon. I'm guessing all these X's are drips of blood. The little dots, the red dots, are Damon, like here and up here. Non-supporters reason that since Damon's blood is found by the couch and then again, let's look at that. It's found by the couch and then again by the wall over here. That means that he had to have been stabbed in both these places. Arguably, this reasoning is flawed. Everyone agrees that Damon was stabbed by the couch, moved, and then collapsed by the wall where he deposited blood. This is consistent with the blood map and also with Darlie's story that Damon followed her across the room. But there is no indication from the blood map that Damon was stabbed twice. All the blood map tells us is that Damon was stabbed, moved, and then expired. In many cases, a person who is stabbed or injured moves before they die, thereby leaving blood in 2 different locations. That does not mean that the murderer came back and injured them again at the second location. It simply means that the injured person moved before expiring, which makes complete sense. The blood map does nothing to corroborate this second attack theory. In fact, it corroborates Darlie's story. Perhaps if there was cast-off blood found near or on the wall, that would support the theory that Damon was stabbed there. But no cast-off was identified in that area, and the only blood on the wall was Darlie's, and that wasn't cast off either. See James Cron's testimony. In conclusion, there is no evidence that Damon was stabbed twice. And there's the testimony that you can... Yep. Okay, so... these were some good ones. Yeah. I've heard a lot of these myths before, and it is nice to see testimony talking about this and explaining all of this, dispelling these myths. Wonderful. So again, I would really like to thank Why Darlie Routier is Innocent, Myth versus Fact Facebook page for allowing me to share these. Thank you so much. These are wonderful, wonderful sources of information that you have. Like I said, I'll link down in the description all of the links that they provide to the testimony and to the page, of course, so that you can go and read this for yourself, educate yourself. There are also links on their Facebook page for the documents, the trial testimonies and other documents that you can find there as well. So yeah, we'll continue this on. There's still a bit to go. So please hit subscribe, and thanks for watching.